The first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, watchful silence that settled into her bones and made her breath shallow. The streetlights flickered faintly outside the cafe window as Ava Miller wiped down the last table, unaware that her life was about to split into a clear before and after. She had stayed late again, covering for a coworker, her mind already drifting toward the warmth of her small apartment and the safety of routine. That safety vanished the moment she stepped outside. The night air felt sharper than usual, colder, as if warning her. She barely took 3 steps before she heard it, a sound she wasn't supposed to hear. A gunshot. One single controlled shot, followed by a body collapsing in the alley across the street. Ava froze. Her heart stopped beating properly. She should have run. She should have screamed. Instead, she stood there, hidden in shadow, watching as a man stepped forward, calm and unhurried, his silhouette carved from darkness itself. He turned his head slightly, and for one terrifying second, his eyes met hers. He saw her. The world tilted. She ran then, heart pounding, lungs burning, unaware that she had just become the only witness to something that was never meant to be seen. By the time Ava reached her apartment, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unlock the door. She locked it behind her, pressed her back against it, and slid to the floor, trying to breathe. She told herself it was shock, that once the adrenaline faded, everything would feel normal again. But deep down, she knew nothing would ever be normal. That man's face, cold, unreadable, powerful, burned into her memory. She didn't know his name, but the city knew him. Everyone did. Matteo DeLuca, the Mafia boss people whispered about and never looked for twice. She didn't know it yet, but while she was hiding in her apartment, Matteo was already making calls, already controlling the fallout, already asking one single question: who saw it? The knock on her door came just after midnight. Ava nearly screamed. She crept forward, heart racing, and looked through the peephole. 2 men stood outside, dressed too well, standing too straight. Not police. Her blood ran cold. She backed away slowly, every instinct screaming danger. The knock came again, firmer this time. "Miss Miller," a voice called calmly. "We just want to talk." She didn't answer. She grabbed her phone, hands trembling, and dialed 911, but before the call could connect, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Unknown number. She stared at it, torn between terror and desperation, and then answered. "Don't open the door," a deep voice said quietly. Her breath caught. "Who is this?" she whispered. There was a pause, then the same voice, calm and commanding. "The man who just saved your life." The knocking stopped. Footsteps retreated. Ava slid down onto the floor again, shaking. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. The answer came without hesitation. "Because from today," he said, "you stay with me." She tried to protest, to argue, to tell him she wanted nothing to do with him or whatever world he belonged to, but the call ended before she could say another word. Minutes later, headlights flashed outside her window. A black car waited below. Ava stood there, staring down at it, knowing with a terrifying certainty that refusing was not an option. When she finally stepped outside, her knees felt weak. The car door opened before she reached it. Inside, Matteo DeLuca waited, his presence filling the space without effort. He didn't touch her, didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at her with those same dark eyes. "You're safe now," he said. Ava swallowed hard. "I don't want this," she whispered. Matteo's gaze softened just slightly. "I know," he replied, "but wanting has nothing to do with survival." The car pulled away, carrying her into a world of danger, secrets, and a man whose protection came at a cost she didn't yet understand. That night, in the quiet luxury of Matteo's mansion, Ava lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how a single moment had changed everything. She was the only witness, and he was the only protection. And somewhere between fear and safety, something far more dangerous was beginning to grow. Ava woke up to silence so complete it felt unreal, the kind of quiet that only existed in places where chaos was carefully kept outside thick walls and guarded doors. The bed beneath her was softer than anything she had ever slept on, the sheets cool and impossibly smooth against her skin. For a few seconds, she forgot where she was. Then memory rushed back. The gunshot, the alley, the knock on her door, the black car, and the man who had looked at her and decided her fate with a single sentence. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket to her chest as she took in the room. It was elegant but restrained. Not flashy, every detail deliberate. This wasn't a guest room meant to impress, it was meant to be secure. She swung her legs off the bed and padded toward the window, pulling the heavy curtains aside just enough to see out. The mansion grounds stretched far and wide, surrounded by iron gates and tall hedges, guards positioned at careful intervals. There was no escaping this place without being seen. The realization settled heavily in her chest. A soft knock came at the door, making her flinch. It opened a moment later, and a woman stepped inside, carrying a tray. She looked kind, older than Ava by many years, with calm eyes that suggested she had seen much worse things than fear in a young woman's face. "Good morning," she said gently. "Mr. DeLuca asked that you be comfortable." Ava nodded stiffly, unsure what to say. Comfortable felt like the wrong word. The woman set the tray down and paused. "You are safe here," she added quietly, as if it were a truth she needed to hear. When she left, Ava sank onto the edge of the bed again, staring at the food untouched. Safe. The word sounded strange now, tied to a man whose name made people lower their voices. Later that morning, Matteo found her in the garden. Ava hadn't heard him approach, only sensed his presence the way one senses a storm before the first drop falls. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed yet commanding. "Did you sleep?" he asked. She turned to face him, forcing herself not to look away. "I didn't ask to be here," her voice steadier than she felt. Matteo inclined his head slightly. "I know." "Then let me go," she replied. He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing something invisible. "If I let you go," he said calmly, "you will be dead within a week." The words weren't cruel, they were factual. Ava's breath caught. "Because I saw something?" she asked. "Because you exist," he answered. "In my world, witnesses don't get second chances. I gave you one." She wrapped her arms around herself. "So I'm your prisoner?" Matteo shook his head. "No, you're under my protection. There is a difference." Days passed, slow and heavy, each one blurring into the next. Ava was allowed to move freely within the estate, but she quickly learned the boundaries without anyone having to explain them. Guards were always nearby, always watching, though they kept their distance. Matteo came and went, sometimes gone for hours, sometimes for entire nights. When he was there, the house felt different, charged with a quiet intensity. He never raised his voice, never made threats, never touched her without permission, yet his presence was inescapable. She found herself listening for his footsteps without meaning to, noticing when his voice carried through the halls. One evening, she found him in his study, standing by the window with a glass in his hand, the city lights glowing faintly in the distance. She hesitated at the door, then stepped inside. "Why me?" she asked softly. Matteo turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Because you didn't run fast enough," he said after a moment. The answer surprised a short, humorless laugh out of her. "That's it? That's how fate usually works," he replied. He set the glass down. "You could have screamed. You could have called the police. You didn't." Ava swallowed. "I was scared." "So was I," Matteo said quietly. The admission startled her. "You?" she asked. He met her gaze. "In the wrong kind of attention destroys everything. You saw something that could have done that. I chose to protect you instead." There was something almost gentle in his voice then, and it unsettled her more than his coldness ever had. That night, the illusion of safety cracked. Ava awoke to raised voices echoing through the halls, sharp and urgent. She sat up, heart pounding, and before she could even stand, her door opened and Matteo stepped inside. He moved quickly, efficiently, his calm replaced by something darker. "Get dressed," he said. "Now." Fear surged through her. "What's happening?" "Someone tried to get past the outer gate," he replied. "They failed." His eyes softened when they met hers. "But this is why you're here." As they moved through the mansion, Ava realized something terrifying and strangely reassuring at the same time. No matter how dangerous his world was, Mateo stood firmly between it and her, and as fear tangled with gratitude, she began to understand the truth she had been avoiding. Staying with him wasn't just about survival anymore, it was becoming about trust. The mansion settled into a tense stillness after the failed intrusion, as if every wall and corridor were holding its breath. Ava sat in the small sitting room near the garden, fingers curled tightly around a cup of tea she hadn't tasted. Guards moved with heightened awareness outside the windows, their shadows stretching long in the early morning light. Mateo had disappeared again, pulled away by responsibilities she didn't fully understand and was no longer sure she wanted to. The fear from the night before still clung to her, but beneath it lay something new, an aching curiosity about the man who had placed himself between her and danger without hesitation. When Mateo finally returned, his jacket was gone, and the sleeves of his shirt were rolled up, revealing faint scars along his forearms. Ava noticed them before she could stop herself, each mark telling a story she hadn't been meant to read. He caught her looking, but didn't comment. "You should stay inside today," he said calmly. "Things are unsettled." Ava lifted her chin. "I can't hide forever." Mateo regarded her thoughtfully. "No," he agreed, "but you can survive by choosing when to step into the light." His words lingered with her long after he walked away. As days passed, Mateo began involving her in small choices, where she preferred to spend her afternoons, which areas of the estate made her feel safest. It wasn't control disguised as kindness, it was an effort to give her something she hadn't realized she'd lost, the right to decide. Ava found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't expected, laughing softly with the house staff, walking the garden paths at dusk, breathing without constant panic. And yet, the danger was never far. She saw it in the way Mateo's gaze constantly assessed his surroundings, in the way his phone never left his side. One afternoon, Ava overheard raised voices coming from Mateo's office. She wasn't trying to listen, but his name and hers were spoken too clearly to ignore. "She's a liability," someone argued, "a loose end." Ava's heart sank. Mateo's response was immediate and cold. "She's under my protection. Anyone who touches her answers to me." Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Ava stepped away quietly, her chest tight with emotions she didn't have the words for. Fear, gratitude, and something dangerously close to loyalty. That night, she found Mateo alone on the terrace, the city lights shimmering below like a distant promise. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, stepping beside him. "You don't have to protect me." Mateo turned, studying her face as if searching for something. "I made a decision. I don't undo them." Ava hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her chest. "What happens when this is over?" Mateo's jaw tightened. "In my world," he said quietly, "it's never truly over." The honesty in his voice sent a shiver through her. Their bond deepened in silence rather than grand gestures, shared meals, long conversations about nothing and everything. Ava learned that Mateo had grown up too fast, that power had been thrust upon him before he could choose another path. Mateo learned that Ava had always lived carefully, avoiding attention, avoiding risks. She was everything his world was not, and that contrast drew him in despite his better judgment. The breaking point came when Ava was taken. It happened in the span of seconds during what should have been a safe outing within the garden grounds, a breach no one had anticipated. One moment she was walking near the garden gates, the next she was pulled into a vehicle, the door slammed shut, the world reduced to fear and motion. When Matteo received the call, his control snapped. He mobilized everything he had, his voice cold and lethal. Bring her back, alive. Hours later, when Ava was returned to him, shaken but unharmed, Matteo held her gaze with a fierceness that stole her breath. I told you, he said quietly, from today you stay with me. And for the first time, Ava didn't argue. Ava didn't speak for a long time after she was brought back. She sat wrapped in a blanket in Matteo's private living room, her eyes fixed on a single spot on the wall, as if her mind were still somewhere else. Matteo stayed close, but didn't touch her, didn't rush her, didn't ask questions. He simply remained there, a quiet presence anchoring her back to reality. Every now and then, she felt his gaze on her, heavy with something darker than anger and deeper than fear. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. They knew my name. Matteo's jaw tightened. I know, he said softly. That's my fault. She looked at him then, startled. How? Because once you became mine to protect, he replied. You became valuable. The honesty of it cut sharper than any lie. The days that followed were wrapped in a new kind of tension. Security doubled. The estate felt smaller, the walls closer. Ava was never alone now, not even in the garden. And yet, strangely, she didn't feel suffocated. She felt chosen. Matteo spoke to her more, his reserve thinning in small, careful ways. He explained the rules of his world without glorifying them, without hiding the darkness either. Ava listened, absorbing everything, understanding that ignorance was no longer a luxury she could afford. If you're going to stay, Matteo told her one evening, you deserve to know why things are the way they are. The way he said stay sent an unfamiliar warmth through her chest. Their relationship shifted in subtle moments, a shared look across the room, a quiet smile when their eyes met unexpectedly, a hand offered when she felt overwhelmed. Matteo began to trust her presence in his space, and Ava began to trust that he would never harm her. She noticed the way he softened around her, how the tension in his shoulders eased when she was near. It frightened her how much his mood seemed tied to her safety. It frightened her more how much she cared. One night, Ava couldn't sleep. She wandered into the library, running her fingers along the spines of books she never expected to find in a man like Matteo's home. He was there, sitting in the shadows, reading. You don't fit the stories people tell about you, she said quietly. Matteo looked up, his expression unreadable. Neither do you, he replied. Ava took a breath. What happens if I leave? She asked. The question hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Matteo closed the book slowly. Then I lose my reason to be careful, he said. The weight of his words settled heavily in her chest. She realized then that leaving wasn't just about her safety anymore, it was about his. The final confrontation began without warning, an attack on Matteo's territory, calculated and brutal. Ava was moved to a secure room as chaos erupted beyond the walls. She sat alone, heart racing, listening to distant sounds she wished she couldn't recognize. Fear clawed at her, but beneath it was something steady, trust. When Matteo finally returned hours later, his clothes marked with the evidence of battle, Ava rushed to him without thinking. He stopped just short of touching her, as if afraid of what it might mean. I told you to stay inside, he said quietly. I did, but I never stopped worrying. Their eyes held, the unspoken truth finally surfacing between them. In the aftermath, Ava understood what her presence had changed. Matteo's world was still dangerous, still unforgiving, but he was no longer navigating it alone. She had become his constant, his reason to pause before pulling the trigger, his reminder of a life that could exist beyond shadows. And as she stood beside him, watching dawn break over a city that would never know what it owed them both, Ava realized that staying with Matteo was no longer something forced upon her. It was a choice she was making willingly. The days after the attack felt strangely quiet, like the pause after a storm when the world tries to remember how to breathe. Ava noticed the change in Matteo before he ever spoke of it. He was more thoughtful now, more careful, as if every decision carried her name somewhere in its weight. He spent less time away from the mansion and more time near her, not watching, not guarding, but simply existing in the same space. Sometimes they sat in silence, the kind that didn't demand words. Ava realized then that she had stopped counting exits and started memorizing the sound of his footsteps instead. One afternoon, Matteo took her beyond the estate gates for the first time since the kidnapping. The city looked different from inside his car, less frightening, more fragile. "You don't have to do this," Ava said softly, her fingers gripping the seat. Matteo glanced at her. "You can't live only behind walls," he replied, "and neither can I." They walked through a quiet street market, guards at a distance, blending into the crowd. For the first time, Ava saw Matteo without the weight of command in his posture. People passed him without fear, without recognition. He was just a man beside her, and that realization made her chest ache in a way she didn't fully understand. That evening, Ava confronted the truth she had been avoiding. "What happens to me when this is all over?" she asked. Matteo didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low. "If you leave," he said, "I will make sure you're protected for the rest of your life." Ava shook her head. "That's not what I asked." Matteo turned toward her, something vulnerable flickering behind his eyes. "If you stay," he continued, "my enemies will never stop trying to use you against me." Ava met his gaze steadily. "And if I go," she said, "you'll never stop wondering if I'm safe." The truth settled between them like a promise neither of them had dared to name. The tension between them finally broke one quiet night when the power went out across the estate. Emergency lights flickered on, casting long shadows. Ava found Matteo in the hallway, his concern immediate. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. "Are you?" He exhaled slowly, relief clear on his face. In that moment, the distance between them felt meaningless. "You've changed everything," Matteo admitted quietly. Ava's voice trembled. "So have you." He didn't touch her, but he leaned close enough that she could feel his warmth. The air between them felt charged, restrained not by fear, but by respect. Later, alone in her room, Ava realized the truth she could no longer deny. She wasn't staying because she was afraid to leave. She was staying because she had found something rare in a world built on danger: trust, protection without possession, strength without cruelty. Matteo had never forced her heart. He had only guarded it long enough for it to choose on its own. And somewhere deep within Matteo, a line had been crossed. Protecting Ava was no longer a responsibility, it was a promise, one he intended to keep, no matter the cost. The final threat came quietly, without gunfire or shouting, slipping into Matteo's world like a shadow that knew exactly where to stand. Ava sensed it before anyone told her. Matteo grew distant in a way that felt deliberate, his words careful, his presence heavy with unspoken decisions. One evening, she found him standing alone in the garden, the night air cool and still. "You're thinking about ending this," she said softly. Matteo didn't turn around. "I'm thinking about keeping you alive," he replied. Ava stepped closer, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "You already are." He finally faced her, and in his eyes she saw the truth: love restrained by fear of what it could cost her. The choice was made for them when Matteo's enemies issued their final move, not against him, but against everything he cared about. Ava was escorted to a safe location, while Matteo dismantled the threat piece by piece, not with cruelty, but with precision born from resolve. For the first time, his actions were guided not by power, but by the future he wanted to protect. Ava waited, surrounded by silence and uncertainty, holding on to the belief that he would come back, not because he had to, but because he chose to. When Matteo finally returned, exhaustion etched into his features, Ava ran to him without hesitation. This time, he didn't stop her. He held her carefully, as if she were something precious and real in a world that had never allowed him such things. "It's over," he said quietly. Ava rested her forehead against his chest. "What happens now?" Mateo lifted her chin gently. "Now," he said, "you decide." Ava didn't answer right away. She thought of the girl she had been, the one who avoided risk, who believed safety meant staying unnoticed. That girl was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who understood that love didn't always come gently, but it could still be pure. She met Mateo's gaze. "I stay," she said, "not because I need protection, but because I choose you." Something in Mateo's expression broke open, a relief so deep it looked like pain leaving his body. The world didn't change overnight. Mateo's life was still complex, still demanding, but it softened at the edges. He made space for something real, something honest. Ava became his constant, not hidden, not controlled, but respected. She walked beside him, not behind. And Mateo, for the first time, allowed himself to imagine a future not built on fear, but on trust. Some nights, Ava would think back to the moment that changed everything. The gunshot, the alley, the voice that had said, "From today, you stay with me." She realized now that it had never been a command, it had been a promise. And as she stood beside Mateo, watching the city lights glow in the distance, she understood that love hadn't rescued her from danger, it had taught her how to face it, together.